there's large parts of our history, like they were talking about history backed by an ideology or a philosophy. But I think that there's a real danger in letting history serve an ideology. Because the moment you treat history as a slave or a servant, and you send it out in the world to do your bidding, then you're only propagating a certain kind of ideology, and more often than not imposing it on everybody else. I think we are in the real danger of that happening all the time. And again, I think it's the human condition. Humans acting in groups always try to impose their will and their opinion on others. This entire book actually started when we read an article in the London Telegraph, which was very, very strange, because in 2013, the National War Museum in London had this survey, and they had military historians do this survey, and they came out with an amazing fact, that the Battle of Kohima was the greatest battle that Britain had ever fought, which Namita had spoken about earlier. Now this is very surprising, because Britain in the European theatre has fought all their major wars, their major battles. One small cantonment town in the northeast, how could it even be possible that Britain or the English considered it to be the biggest battle? So that the entire process for this book, about this book and this story, started from there. And then we started doing research, and we understood that on that fateful day, which was 4/4/44, as in 4th April 44, Britain could actually have lost India. And this is borne out by their communications between Churchill and Mountbatten, who was the commander-in-chief here. And Churchill said that on my watch, no matter what happens, I would not want to lose India. I don't want to supervise the breakup of the empire. And what had happened is that in 2 days, in those 2 fateful days, I think the entire history of India actually took a wrong turn. Because if they had won, and they had won at Kohima, the road to Calcutta was open, there was nobody to oppose them, and India would have gone a completely different way. So this backdrop is what really excited us, and so we started asking the attorney, what if it wasn't a straightforward battle, but what if there was a betrayal? What if it was brought about by forces, desperate forces that came together at Kohima and to vie for the brightest jewel in the town, which was India itself. And as we know, the history of battles and revolutions in India, betrayal is one strong undercurrent that runs through everything. I mean, in India, it's famous that not every gun is trained at the enemy. There's been times when we've trained our guns upon each other and ourselves and brought down great things from happening. So that's how the process for this book started.
May I?
Sorry, yes, please.
I think we were talking about how history has there can be different viewpoints of history, and here where I would like to differ, because though of course this was a huge battle, and Britain really got a massive scare and they almost lost it. But I think suppose the INA had managed to get into Calcutta, I don't think the British would have been overthrown, because the INA didn't have the strength to carry on and conquer the whole country. What I think Subhash Chandra Bose was expecting, was hoping, was that India would arise, right, because the army had come in, and because the INA had come into Calcutta and Dhaka. But the British had put all our leadership into jail. Everyone was in jail at that time. So without that leadership, I don't know whether there would have been an uprising.
But Mr. Darkar, you know what happened? After the INA lost, and Tigwanshu will know this whole history, of course. After the INA lost, the British were very triumphant, and they said, we're going to teach them a lesson. So they say that, they chose 3 men, and Subhash Chandra Bose himself couldn't have chosen better, because he chose a Muslim, a Sikh, and a Hindu, and he put them up for trial, and the British put them up for trial. And the whole point was that treason against emperor. But the point they made was, we are an independent government, we are a provisional government, and we do not owe allegiance to the crown. So when they actually fought the case, and those men were actually, sentenced to death, what happened was the country actually rose up. Even the leaders, if they weren't around, the Bombay Mutiny happened, and the kind of domino effect that started to happen. And finally, they understood that there is actually no way that we can actually stay on in India. So, though they didn't win, the point is that the kind of turning point was the fact that they fought. They didn't just lie down and they didn't just keep on accepting, and they said, okay, it's something, even at, and what Subhash Chandra Bose keeps on saying, that, you know, that idea that we have to sacrifice. Are you willing to do that? So they were willing to do that, and that is what caught, I think, the imagination of the entire country, and everybody from that point onwards, they knew that they could stay on in India. And Sanjay, if you would like to share what you were talking about, that book that you...
Yeah, so it was, in fact, it reads like fiction. I mean, a really good author couldn't have thought of a better plot than this, because, in fact, Bose couldn't have asked for anything better to happen with what he was trying. And Tishu and I were discussing how ironical the entire experience must have been for the British, because what they were trying to prevent in actually smothering information about Bose and everything else, but when they put these three people on trial, they actually publicized what they were trying to actually keep under wraps. And when that happened, for the life of them, they couldn't have understood, because Bose's main aim was, he knew the INA was too strong, but it was a symbolic force. And he thought that the Indian army, that is the British Indian army, would actually rise in rebellion. They would see their brothers wearing another uniform, and they'd realize that they were mercenaries actually, and they would go over the other side, because that was the true Indian army, in his words. I mean, opinions can of course differ, but that never happened. However, because of the Red Fort trials, it all came to light, and India suddenly started becoming patriotic in a different kind of way. When their field marshal, was asked in 1942 that, can you hold India? His reply was, I have no reason to suspect the loyalty of the Indian sepoy, sepoy as they used to call them. But in 1945, when he was asked the same question, he did not reply for a long time. And when he replied, he says, I have no answer to give. I cannot guarantee the loyalty of the Indian sepoy today, because he has seen what it is to be Indian. So their foundations were shaking. And when the first mutiny, the naval mutiny, happened in Bombay, they realized that they could not hold on anymore. There is a very interesting book which is out now called Holding On to the Jewel. And it's by a British historian who's, again, there's been records that have now come out in the open, and documents and files, secret files and everything. And it's amazing that the British actually never intended to leave India. And strangely enough, they had earmarked a plot, 150 acres in size, outside Delhi, to keep as their embassy. A 150-acre plot, which would help India militarily and economically. They wanted to hold on even then, because they thought that they could give some form of autonomy, people would be happy, and they would never have to leave. So what compelled them to leave ultimately was the fact that they did not have the manpower, the sepoy, the eternal sepoy who guarded every cantonment. They did not have him on their side, and they could not hold on to his loyalty. They decided that before they are slaughtered to a man, which was a nightmare from the 57 mutiny, they better leave. And their communications that happened at that time bear this out to a large extent.
Just tell you an incident. When the trial started happening, the first day of the trial, when Guru Bakshi, as Namita said, there were 3 officers put on trial, a Sikh, a Hindu and a Muslim. So Guru Bakshi and Dhillon was a Sikh, Prem Sehgal, जो वो शाद अली के नाना है, प्रेम सहगल and Shahnawaz Khan, a Muslim. So they were taking the trials happened at the Red Fort. The Salimgarh Fort, within the Red Fort, there's a POW camp was made, and they were taking inside the truck. So Gorkha soldiers were escorting them along with some British officers. The British officer pushed Dhillon. Jaldi chalo karke. He pushed. Dhillon turned and slapped him. There's a brief scuffle happened between them. But no Gorkha soldier came up to save the British officer. And And then Jawaharlal Nehru, because Jawaharlal Nehru was part of the defense committee who was fighting the case for the INA, he came up and said, this is the first sign of independence. Today we saw. Because a British officer was, slapped, and none of the Gurkha soldiers kind of came to help. And the trial happened. That was the beginning of the trial. So, actually, INA sahi hua jo kuch hua.
But it's about time that people use this history.
Yeah, absolutely. No, but these are the incredible ifs and buts of history. Now we don't know what would have happened in Britain if the Tories were in power and Churchill was Prime Minister and not Attlee had been the Prime Minister. Again, we can only guess.
We can only guess, and that is why writing fiction is the best thing possible.
And on that note,
And it's not just, it's also safe. Very safe.
and on that note, is there anyone who has one or two quick questions to ask the authors, the panelists, or would everyone like to now head towards the bar? Poonam, Maria.
You will ask me, have the kids gone to sleep?